Okay, thank you for attending today. We're back here again because every time you look at this budget and you get deeper and deeper, you really find that this budget is simply a sham. And that's what it is. This budget has illegitimate numbers, purposely misleading numbers that obviously will result in a deficit a year from now. And probably most importantly, it's going to hurt the state of Connecticut, and I would argue the families in the state of Connecticut. What we talked about the last time, looking at the board, we had $458 million of contracts that didn't exist. Now we're talking about $180 million of money that's being added to consensus revenue, an absolute violation of the law that was passed under Governor Rell, that the Democrats passed to make sure that we all use the same numbers. And the last part about the budget is finding the $50 million that in the second part of the budget says the OPM secretary has to find $50 million of new fees and revenue generators to balance the budget. So you're almost at $700 million in debt as we stand here now. And because of that, once again, we call upon this governor not to sign a sham budget. The hypocrisy can't be any more apparent than what we've seen. In 2008, 2009, when Governor Rell did her budget, the issue was that Governor Rell was using figures that were not realistic because they did not match OFA. And the Democrats decided, with their majority and overriding a veto by Governor Rell, they decided to change the methodology for budgeting and said, we are going to use consensus revenue, where OPM and OFA get together and decide on what the revenue is for the next 2 years based upon current law. And that is the basis for which we will use for budgeting. And then you do pluses and minuses from that relative to the changes in your tax law. And I'll point out, Keith Vaniff did this back in 2015, I think it was, doing how consensus revenue works to create a budget. And that's an accurate display. What the Democrats did was to take consensus revenue and add $90 million more revenue for a total of $180 million over the next 2 years without any policy change. And how did they do that? What they did is they took withholding that OFA put at 4%, and they added 1.5% for the next 2 years. Why? No policy reason, just because they wanted to. That is in complete and absolute violation of the very statute that through their majority they passed. If you look at this board, Governor Lamont, when he did his budget, talked about an increase of 2.7 and 2.2. Consensus revenue talked about 4.0 and 4.0. In the budget, it went up to 5.5 to 5.5. That's what they did. There is no procedure for which you can change consensus revenue. It's never been done in the 10 years that we've been in this building and this law passed. We have laws because you have to follow the law. And when you don't follow the law, something is wrong. This Democrats' bill that they passed. We talk about transparency in government, talk about transparency in budgeting. Governor Lamont had indicated that we're going to have a very transparent policy and a transparent budget, neither of which we have seen in this budget. Nothing has been transparent. Clearly, the numbers have not. Now, I called OFA and talked to Neil and asked him about these numbers, and he knew that they exist, but he's not ready or willing, as OFA, to agree that the numbers should be 5.5. So, adding 180 million, the only argument that I could see for doing that. They couldn't balance the budget. That's why you have to find $50 million in year two. You can't balance a budget. So you make up numbers. And you try to tell the people of Connecticut that's honest budgeting. I humbly disagree with that very notion. And no matter what the argument was, no matter what people say they believe that number was, the bottom line is we use consensus data. That's how we operate in this building. I would also add, not once did anybody hear on the floor of the House and the floor of the Senate when the budget was announced that, oh, by the way, just in full transparency, we deviated for the first time in 10 years from consensus revenue. You didn't see that admission. And if you looked at what happened in finance, it was the first time ever they gave the data in a different format. Usually they show 2019, then the 20, then the 21, so you could find it. They didn't do that this year. Why? Because they didn't want you to know. They didn't want you to know that they hid the number. If you're going to do it, fess up and say, oh, by the way, we decided to add $90 million. This is why. We're standing up and telling you. Why wouldn't you? Why wouldn't you? So we think, based upon all those things we mentioned, the fact that Moody's says we believe there's a recession coming. Ben Barnes thinks that there's a recession coming. I had a conversation with Don Klepper-Smith. You all remember him, the advisor to Governor Rell and a well-known economist, well-respected, to see what his numbers were pretty close to Governor Lamont's numbers. He believes that there's no way you can support the high numbers on withholding. If anybody thinks that the state of Connecticut is going to have a 9.5% increase each of the next 2 years, I don't know what world they're living in. It's not the world I see. It's not the GEP that's been in the negative. We haven't recovered the jobs from 2008, only 80 some odd percent. This is very bad for the state of Connecticut. Unfortunately, this is what happens when you have one party rule. So if there are any questions, happy to take them.